Thank you everyone for being here. I know this is your class, so, but guests as well. I know guests on Zoom. Thank you for being here too. I know you can't see me. I'm behind the camera, but my name is Dr. Sandra Russell, and I'm so happy to welcome Jonathan Square to our class today to talk about his work. And I'm just going to read a couple of brief bios. First, I'm going to read Jonathan's bio, and we also have Dr. Siobhan May here, who collaborates with Dr. Square. So she's here as well, and she's to be part of the conversation. So I'll introduce Jonathan, and I'd like to thank Gender Studies too for sponsoring this event. All right. Dr. Jonathan Michael Square is the Assistant Professor of Black Visual Culture at Parsons School of Design. He was previously a lecturer in the Committee on a Degree in History and Literature at Harvard University, and a fellow in the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the recipient of numerous scholarships and grants. Dr. Square's work considers histories of enslavement, the lens of fashion, and his research has appeared in numerous scholarly and public facing venues. I just ran up the stairs before this, so I'm like, currently, he's working on a book manuscript titled Negro Cloth: How Slavery Birthed the American Fashion Industry. He has curated exhibitions at Harvard University and the Herron School of Art and Design, and is currently curating another exhibition at the Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library. And I'm also going to introduce Dr. Siobhan May here in our classroom. He's a lecturer in the Manning College of Information and Computer Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Siobhan's research explores the intersections of fashion, narrative, and translation in literary traditions of the Black Atlantic. Siobhan has translated scholarly and literary texts from French, Haitian Creole, and Korean. Her co-translation of North Korean dictator Emu Baek's memoir in verse titled Flower Swallows Sing appeared in 2020 with Holland Press. Siobhan is co-founder of the digital humanities project Rendering Revolution, which explores Haitian history and literature through the lens of material culture. Siobhan's research and translation has been supported by the Institute for Citizen Scholars, the Five College Women's Studies Research Center, and the Massachusetts Society of Professors. Okay, thank you both for being here. Jonathan, I will give the floor to you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Thumbs up. You can hear me? Do I need to speak louder? What about the people joining virtually? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Let me know if you have trouble hearing anything. I can repeat myself or speak louder. Super happy to be here. Thank you, Sandra, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak to your class. This is a real treat for me because normally when I'm asked to give a lecture or a talk, people ask me to focus on my research and less on my use of social media. So I'm kind of excited and honored to be able to talk about my practice that involves social media. So I'm just going to jump right in. We can be really informal about this. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to jump in as I'm speaking or ask a question in the chat. I'm going to share my screen. And when I share my screen, I can't follow the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in with your question. Let's see. Dr. Portia Moore asks, afterwards, can someone drop a long for the other scholar whose bio was?
Yes, I can do that. A link,
Okay.
just the text, I can do that. Okay, a link. Okay. All right, I can do that. Siobhan, do you want to send me a link to your? I can do that.
Great.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Cool.
All right, and so I'll just jump right in. I'll share my screen, and at some point I'm going to ask my dear friend and colleague Siobhan May to join me. And Siobhan is there in person.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, Sandra, can you make me a co-host?
Yes, I sure can. All right. Co-host. All right,
Great.
got it?
Yes. All right, as I said, I'm going to focus on my use of social media as an educational tool. And often this kind of work is described as digital humanities. You might have heard that term before. Basically, it's the use of the internet or digital platforms as an educational tool. And one thing that me and Siobhan often think about is what we do is a little more dynamic than digital humanities because it's often described to describe like archives or digital repositories. And like what we do is when you use social media, you're really sort of engaging with audiences and people can respond to what you're posting. It's not a sort of one-way conversation. And so somehow digital humanities doesn't feel like the most appropriate term. But sometimes you have to use terms to make yourself legible to academics. And so sometimes we find ourselves using the term digital humanities, even though it's more social media. So I'm going to talk a little bit about me first. As your professor said in my introduction, I'm an assistant professor of Black visual culture at Parsons School of Design. Before I joined Parsons, I taught at Harvard in the Committee on Degrees in History and Literature. I was also a curatorial fellow in the Costume Institute at the Met. And I also founded a digital humanities project called Fashioning Self in Slavery and Freedom. And I also co-founded the Digital Humanities Project with Siobhan May, who's there in person. So a little bit about my work. I've made a career studying the connection between fashion and slavery, which for many people are two very disparate areas of study. I'm hearing a little feedback. Does someone have their, is someone unmuted?
Oh yeah, maybe could everybody in the Zoom mute themselves, please? Thank you.
Okay. So I'm interested in the interaction between the histories of enslavement and the genesis of the fashion system in the 18th and 19th centuries. I research how enslaved people use their fashion bodies to fight for more freedom and express their multifarious and unique cultural identities. I'm working on a book manuscript right now on enslaved people's dress. Hopefully, I'll be signing a book contract in the coming weeks, fingers crossed. And the Digital Humanities Project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, was actually the name of a course that I designed at New York University, where I did my PhD. And I created a Facebook page that was meant to sort of be in tandem with the course as a way for students to engage with the material outside of the classroom. And I've taught versions of this class at FIT and at Harvard. I launched the project in 2016, and the project lives primarily on social media. But as you'll see as I continue through this talk, there's also an analog or hard copy version of the project too. Oops, already mentioned that first bullet point. I'm working on a book manuscript, a traditional academic monograph that's on enslaved people's dress. The tentative title is Negro Cloth, How Slavery Birthed the American Fashion Industry. I am a traditional university-trained academic. I have a university position at Parsons, but I'm also a big proponent of using social media as a tool of radical pedagogy and as a means of democratizing higher education, which in many ways is unusual for academics. Many of my friends and colleagues steer clear of the use of social media. If they do use social media, it's purely for pleasure. Like they share photos of their cat or just vacation photos. They don't use it as an educational tool. If they do use social media as an educational tool, it's typically Twitter and not Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. But I have, of course, I have a personal Instagram account, but I also have a professional Instagram account. So a lot of my academic work lives on social media and in the popular press. So these are my handles. So I'm on Instagram under the username Fashioning the Self. I'm also on Facebook, and Facebook is actually the first platform that I started using in this way. And so my largest following actually is on Facebook, even though I know the kids aren't using Facebook anymore. But I like it. And many of my most loyal followers are actually on Facebook. I also tweet. And on Twitter, the username is Fashioning Self. You can only have so many characters on Twitter, so Fashioning the Self is not available because it's too long. I also use YouTube, where I post longer talks, kind of like this, or shorter content. And that short content, I also post on TikTok. And I gotta be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of TikTok. I like longer form content that's like maybe at 5 minutes, 6 minutes, even longer. I was resistant to using TikTok. My attention span is just not, I need longer engagement. But I started creating shorter videos for Instagram Reels. And I would automatically, whenever I created a reel for Instagram, I just posted on TikTok without really engaging with content on TikTok. But one of my TikTok videos went semi-viral, and I was like, never mind, I like TikTok. So I'm on TikTok now, which I didn't include in here, but it's just Fashioning the Self on TikTok. I also have a website for Fashioning the Self, which for the longest time I didn't have. I actually need to update this website, but it's sort of the storefront or brick and mortar presence for Fashioning the Self. So as your professor mentioned, also write for what I would call a popular press. Many academics publish only in sort of peer-reviewed academic journals. And I publish those kind of articles too, because I have to. Get tenure at some point. But I also enjoy writing for outlets like Guernica or Fashionista. Ms. Magazine, I wrote an article on Harriet Tubman's style for Ms. Magazine. I'm really proud of this article that I wrote, and actually, I kind of wish I had written it for the introduction of the book that I'm working on. I might use this as inspiration for the intro to my manuscript. And one reason that I'm really a fan of this article is the editor spent a lot of time working with me to perfect my argument. So it's a piece of writing that I feel really confident standing behind. And I know you read this for today's class, so we can have a conversation about what I'm actually arguing in the article. But in a lot of ways, this article is representative of the kind of articles that I like to write. Typically, for online outlets, typically not behind a paywall. I am also a curator, and this is the first exhibition that I curated. It was when I was teaching at Harvard. I got a grant from a university, sort of a faculty development grant. And I used that money to curate this exhibition. It wasn't a lot of money. I curated it on a shoestring budget. And most of the artists in the exhibition were people that I knew or friends. And I was really interested in Harvard's relationship with slavery. And I did almost everything for this exhibition, including designing the wall text, writing the wall labels, the art handling. Often for museums or cultural institutions, there's a person who's called a registrar who tracks shipment of artwork. I basically did that myself. Sometimes it was just a matter of like going to the artist studio, picking up the artwork and taking it to Harvard. The only thing that I didn't do myself was hanging the artwork. I don't have any art handling experience, and I wanted the exhibition to look professional. So I did work with a team of art handlers to hang the work. And basically the show used contemporary art to explore Harvard's connection to slavery. And my favorite artwork in the exhibition is this one right here, where the cursor is. The exhibition was in a hallway of a public building on Harvard's campus. I initially approached traditional gallery spaces, but galleries are sort of booked years in advance. And so I had to use a non-traditional space. So this was a building on Harvard's campus that includes both administrative offices and classrooms. And at first I was a little nervous about using this space because for security reasons, it's not a building that you have a badge, that you need a badge to get into. So I was just worried about the security of the artwork. But one thing I liked about using a public space or a space that's not a traditional gallery space is that people were forced to engage with the artwork on their way to class or on their way to work. So it had a wider reach than a show in a traditional gallery space. And because I had very little oversight for this exhibition, I used the Fashioning the Self branding. So if you look at the bottom beneath the title of the exhibition and the dates, I used the Fashioning the Self logo. The university gave me the money and kind of let me do whatever I want, which was great. But going back to what I said a little bit earlier, my favorite artwork in the exhibition was this diptych. And it's a portrait of an enslaved man on the left, whose name is Renty. And he was photographed on behalf of a Harvard professor in the 1850s. And the image on the right is of a famous Harvard professor whose name is Henry Louis Gates. And he was wrongfully arrested in 2009 when he was entering his house in Cambridge. His neighbor saw him struggling to open the door. He's a man of a certain age. He uses a cane. He had some trouble getting the door open. But when the neighbor saw him, she thought it was a burglar and called the police on him. And by the time the police arrived, he had already entered the house. And he had an argument with the police officer. He ended up getting arrested for disorderly conduct. So what I like about the pairing of these two images is sort of thinking about continuities in discrimination against Black Americans. And what's really interesting is that Renty is on the left, Henry is on the right. Their names are almost a play on each other, very similar sounding, Henry Renty. even though there's over a century separating them. And they both, in weird ways, have a connection to Harvard. So that was my favorite artwork in the exhibition. I curated another exhibition at Harvard, which I didn't include in the slideshow. No, I didn't. It was a solo show of the work of the artist Nell Irving Painter, who is a Harvard alum. And she wrote a book called Old in Art School because she was a historian, and she is a historian who taught for a number of years at Princeton, but when she retired, she went back to art school, and got 2 more degrees, so she has a total of 5 degrees, and she's now a professional artist. So basically that show explored her artistic practice, and it was actually 2 exhibitions that were 2 satellite exhibitions. One was in this space, the same space where I did my first exhibition, and the other one was on another part of campus that was a traditional gallery space. Most recently, I curated an exhibition in Indianapolis at the Herron School of Art and Design. And it was very similar to Slavery in the Hands of Harvard, in that I explored the legacy of slavery using contemporary art. That exhibition was quite large. It was 3 large galleries. Over 30 works were included in that show, some by nationally known artists like Carol Walker, Glenn Ligon, Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems. But many of the artists were sort of local artists from Indiana and Indianapolis. And there was some overlap between those artists. There's an artist named Carl Pope who's nationally known, but based in Indiana. Samuel Levi Jones was also one of the artists in that show. And right now, I am in Delaware. Literally right now I'm in Delaware because I'm working on an exhibition that's opening in 2025. So all that's to say is that I also have a curatorial practice that's actually informed by my social media presence. Because essentially what you're doing on social media is curating. And so I started off my curatorial practice using social media, and then I transitioned to, what would you call it? Brick and mortar, in-person, IRL curation. I've also created a magazine that's informed by my social media practice. So I've created 2 Fashioning the Self zines. I'm really lucky. I feel like I'm embedded in a community of very interesting, intelligent, artistic people, and I wanted to use my platform to share their work. I also have a bone to pick with academia. I think academic writing is a bit dry and sometimes inaccessible, and many academics aren't really interested in engaging with larger audiences. But I wanted to create content that to me felt academically rigorous, but was also interesting and readable and even fun. So the first issue was published in 2018, and the second issue was published in 2020. And I know it's been 3 years, but I'm still working on the 3rd issue, which hopefully will be out at some point. We'll see. I have a lot going on. These are the covers of both of those magazines. The one on the left is the first issue. On the right is the second issue. My friend James wrote the cover article of the first issue, and that's a portrait of him in the first issue. The second issue is a photograph by the author of the cover article in the second issue, who's Afro-Brazilian. This is the table of contents for both issues. And, in many ways, these are very personal. This is a very personal project. Like most of the people who contribute to these magazines are my friends. and if not my friends, their colleagues, and if not my colleagues, their former students. I know every single person who contributed to these magazines, and most of them contributed to the magazines because I asked them to. This is just a screenshot of the cover article of the first issue. James wrote about his love of running, but also running as a form of resistance, and also thinking about marronage, which is the act of enslaved people running away from their enslavers or enslavement. This is around the time, if anyone remembers, of Ahmaud Arbery, who was actually killed while he was running, exercising. So he was also thinking about that. This is a screenshot from the cover article of the second issue. And it was written by my friend Hannah Da, who's Afro-Brazilian, and she was thinking about her own family's relationship with fashion. That's a photo of her grandfather on the right. But she's also a practitioner of the Afro-Brazilian religion Candomblé. And she was thinking about, the name of the article is Black Ways of Dressing. So thinking about Afro-Brazilians' relationship with fashion and her own family's relationship with fashion. This is an article written by my dear friend, my best friend, Monique, who at the time worked at a historic house museum in Louisiana. It turned out to be a bad experience. It turned out to be actually a racist experience. And so she wasn't able to continue working there, but she sort of reflected on her relationship with the plantation. Her ancestors actually were enslaved in nearby plantations and also continue to live nearby. So she was thinking about her relationship with the museum that she worked at, but also with her enslaved ancestors. This is an article by my friend Ricky Bird. And we were really thinking about Black archival practice and the bankruptcy of Johnson Publishing, which famously published Jet Magazine and Ebony Magazine. Johnson Publishing has been turned into high-end condos in Chicago. And so she visited the site and wrote a reflection on the dissolution of a Black archive. What I really liked about this magazine is that, people engaged with it online. So when people received their copies, they typically published an image of themselves with the magazine. So it had a second life online, even though it's a hard copy. I also was able to throw a lunch party for the magazine. So these are photographs from the lunch party, which the first one was at Parsons. The image on the right is a conversation between me and some of the authors in the first issue. The second issue came out in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. So the launch party was on IG Live, very appropriately. And that's me in conversation with Hannah Da, who wrote the cover article for the first issue. Also, one really fun thing that I've been able to do through leveraging my social media presence is I partnered with fashion brands. And this is a project that I worked on with the designer Greg Lauren. Greg Lauren is the nephew of Ralph Lauren. His brand is a little different though he is interested in rethinking American sartorial codes, just like Ralph Lauren. There's a higher focus on racial justice and sustainability. And during 2020, there was sort of an uptick in thinking about inequality and consciousness. And Greg Laurin decided to sort of critically interrogate his own mood board and think about what was inspiring his work. And he realized that he was deeply inspired by a group of quilters in Alabama. This community is called Gee's Bend. It still exists. It's been around since the age of slavery, and many of the people there descend from enslaved people. And so this quilting practice has been passed down for generations from the middle of the 19th century. And Gee's Bend is known for a particular form of quilting. Traditional American quilting is very much ordered, like it's sort of geometric shapes, cubes, triangles. And Gee's Bend quilting is a little more freeform. When people first discovered Gee's Bend quilts in the mid-20th century, they were often compared to abstract expressionists. And for that reason, they're highly valued. Unfortunately, I think we can unpack that a little bit, like the fact this form of quilting is valued because of its proximity to whiteness, or this proximity to a white artistic form, I think could be critically interrogated it a little bit. But that's a whole nother conversation that we can have at another time. In any case, Greg Laurin was very much inspired by Gee's Bend and wanted to partner with them. Instead of just printing out images of their quilts and using it to inspire his brand, he wanted to give back to this very much impoverished community. So he reached out to Gee's Bend, and they partnered, and he sent this community scraps of fabric from his atelier. They made the scraps into quilted panels, and then he turned those quilted panels into fashion items. But he partnered with the community in all aspects of the collaboration. The quilters helped design the fashion items. They casted the photo shoot. They designed the logo. They got all the proceeds from the sale of the collection, which was at Bergdorf Goodman. And this is an image of me on the left wearing a parka from that Gee's Bend collaboration. One of the things I did for the collaborations is that I wrote an interpretive essay that was published on Greg Laurin's website, but it was also published in American Craft. And in this essay, I explore my own relationship with quilting, and also thinking about the book Beloved, in which quilting plays a big part. So this was a lot of fun. And it was one of the first times that I'd been asked to use my academic training in new ways. Like many academics simply write peer-reviewed academic articles, write, book manuscripts, academic monographs, teach classes that are related to their area of focus. Less often are academics working with fashion brands. So it was a lot of fun sort of using my knowledge and expertise in new ways, in creative ways, actually. Which gets me thinking about institution building and my own fraught relationship with institutions. When I started fashioning the self, my relationship with institutions was tenuous. I was finishing up my PhD, and I was teaching at universities on a contract basis, which is often referred to as adjuncting. So I wasn't sure that I would continue working at universities because there was just a tenuousness. And honestly, between me and you, I'm not sure if I'll work at an institution for the entirety of my life. I can't see myself in a departmental meeting when I'm 65, but we'll see how my relationship with institutions continue to evolve. But my question for you all is, how does scholarship look outside of the academy? How does scholarship look outside of like gaining a credential? And you know, I've spent a lot of time attached to institutions. I spent more of my adult life attached to institutions than not attached to institutions. I worked 1 year after college, and I worked 1 year between my master's and my PhD. Otherwise, I've been attached to the university, either as a grad student, as an undergrad, grad student, adjunct professor, or full-time professor. Once I pulled out all my mini IDs over the years, I have my ID from college, master's, PhD. You know, I taught at Harvard, taught briefly at FIT, took a class at Columbia. I have all these like little ID cards from like my relationships with universities. In any case, I've never, much of my adult life is I've been attached to institutions, and I wonder how scholarship looks outside of academia. I kind of think of Fashion in Self and Slavery and Freedom as being its own little institution, even though it's an institution of one. But I use it to engage in knowledge production and dissemination on my own terms. And that said, I have another project which was spearheaded and conceptualized by the fabulous Siobhan May, who's present, who's present in your class today. So I might ask Siobhan to jump in the conversation, but before I do, I'm just gonna talk a little bit about our project, Rendering Revolution. Siobhan and I met maybe like a year before the pandemic at UMass Amherst, and we immediately got on very well. We're big fans of each other's work, and we decided to collaborate on this project. It's titled Rendering Revolution, Sartorial Approaches to Haitian History. It's a queer bilingual feminist experiment in digital interdisciplinary scholarship that uses the lens of fashion and material culture to trace the aesthetic, social, and political reverberations of the Haitian Revolution as a world historical moment. Like Fashion in Itself, Rendering Revolution is a project that lives primarily on social media, but we're also really interested in there being a sort of physical or brick and mortar component of the project. One of our long-term goals is to curate an exhibition that's inspired by the project, that's inspired by Haitian art and fashion. And let me just read the second bullet point. By focusing on stories of self-fashioning that rarely receive attention in colonial archives, Rendering Revolution explores the many ways in which let's see, it's covered up. Modern identities were formed in relation to the legacy of slavery in the Americas. The materials produced, curated, and translated for this project focuses on activities of occluded figures in history, including women and members of the LGBTQIA+ community. So if anyone's ever studied the Haitian Revolution before, there's typically a high focus on male-identified figures of the Haitian Revolution, particularly Toussaint Louverture, but others. And so we decided that we wanted to focus on individuals who were often forgotten or ignored in the history of Haiti. And so there's a high focus on queer people and on female-identified individuals. Another really important difference between Rendering Revolution and Fashion in Itself is that it's bilingual content. So we publish in English, of course, because Siobhan and I are both English speakers. But we also publish in Haitian Creole. Siobhan and I are both Haitian Creole second language learners. I'm not going to say speakers because I don't really speak Haitian Creole, but I'm learning Haitian Creole right now because of this project. So drawing on Black feminist thought and transnational queer methodologies, Rendering Revolution generates a transhistorical, undisciplined archive that illustrates the importance of material culture in constructing diverse and often competing visions of freedom in the Atlantic world. And as I mentioned earlier, one of our long-term goals is to create an exhibition inspired by the project. Another thing we want to do is publish an edited volume of scholarly articles that's informed by our project and it focused on Haitian visual culture. One important difference between Rendering Revolution and Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom is that with Fashioning Self in Slavery and Freedom, it's kind of my own thing, but Rendering Revolution, Siobhan conceptualized this project from the very beginning. She came up with the name, she came up with the focus, and then I just sort of glommed on to what she was doing. So I can't take credit for any of the work of Rendering Revolution. We're also a team of people. So, you know, it's maybe Siobhan and I do about 80% of the labor for Rendering Revolution, but also a lot of our contributors have created content and written posts for Rendering Revolution. Many of them are Haitian, and if not Haitian, then are Haitianness, individuals who study Haitian literature and speak Haitian Creole. These are the social media handles. Actually, I feel like I'm talking a lot. Siobhan, do you want to jump in and say anything?
No, I don't know if you're sitting here. You did great. That was good. That was good. That's great. I mean, it's a pleasure. And working on social media is Jonathan. I wanted to work with Jonathan on it because I was in grad school at the time and was really frustrated in the same way as Jonathan said about how you do academic work and where it happens. And I've been following Fashioning the Self for a year or so, and I was just so into it. And I wanted to meet Jonathan really badly because I saw maybe there are other possibilities or other worlds to be built. And I'm sure you'll talk about this too, Jonathan. Of course, we use Instagram and Facebook, and these are proprietary softwares, right? So these are owned by private companies who retain the rights to that data too. So there's a conversation about big tech that can happen, and that Jonathan introduces as well when he talks about this praxis. But Jonathan is really my inspiration for moving my academic work into a public sphere, and I think we can call lots of social media spaces that. So Jonathan was really the first person that I'd seen do that in a way that felt really really purposeful and was really important. So. Siobhan is also Mount Holyoke alum too, so lived in Pearson.
I have to say I love working with Siobhan because I feel really supported working with her. When doing Fashioning the Self by myself, it's just kind of me hovering over my laptop, throwing things online, throwing things out into the ether, not really knowing if I'm doing anything that's interesting or making an impact. But it's always nice to have someone to sort of bounce ideas off of, to ask if I'm going crazy or not, to sort of also when we met, and I think that was in 2019 when we first met, fall 2019, right before the pandemic. We were both in similar places career-wise, either finishing up PhDs or sort of on the job market. And so we've sort of served as a support network for each other as well. So it really is an honor and pleasure to work alongside you, Siobhan.
It's such as an outsider, or observer, I should say, it's such a rich example of collaboration and the possibilities of feminist collaboration. So I mean, that's why you're here, Jonathan. It's just inspiring. It's really inspiring work. So I hope you all take some of that from this as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really enriched my practice in new ways. Having this collaborative platform to work alongside other scholars and also to push myself. You know, I've studied other languages, but you know, in doing this project, I've had to learn Haitian Creole. So, and Javon's been really helpful in that as well. So, thank you. So, I'm probably gonna wrap it up here. As Siobhan alluded to, there's some ongoing questions. These aren't questions that I expect in myself or you all to answer. It's just things that sticky questions that I keep on coming back to in working on rendering revolution and fashioning the self in slavery and freedom. The biggest question is like, what are the pitfalls of using social media as an educational tool? One, social media, you know, I remember the days before social media, and I also know that, you know, social media is not going to last forever. I think for some people, it feels like something, you know, it's permanent, but there is something very ephemeral about social media. And so I wonder what we're going to do in a post-social media world. And actually, I have a quick story to tell you about the ephemerality of social media. One day I logged onto Fashioning the Self, and the account had been shut down. And when it happened, at first I was just like, okay, I'm free. I'll just use other platforms, or I'll transition to you know, post social media engagement with the world. But I was like, no, actually, I want my account. I've spent literally years at that point building an audience. And also I think the biggest thing for me was that I had a lot of connections that I had made over the years. And my only connections to these individuals was through Instagram. Like I didn't have their numbers or their emails. And honestly, I didn't necessarily want their numbers or their emails. But we had a relationship that we had built through Instagram. And I was like, I don't want to lose those connections. And so thankfully, you know, not that I'm all that well connected, but as I mentioned, I had done a fellowship at the Costume Institute. And the director of the Costume Institute is a man named Andrew Bolton. And the Costume Institute puts on, as you know, the annual Met Gala. And the sponsor for the Met Gala, at least the prior year, was Instagram. So I emailed him and told him what's going on. And he forwarded the email to a higher up at Instagram. And they were able to restore the account. I think many people in the world don't have those kind of connections. So if their Instagram is shut down, then you just lose the Instagram. There is a petitioning process that one can do, but I don't think it works very well. And of course, there are millions of users of social media, and they just don't have the time to go through all of those requests. And so I was really thankful that I do have those kind of connections. All that's to say is that social media is really ephemeral and that we don't really own our social media accounts. It's the companies that own the social media accounts. And as soon as they want to shut them down, they can and will. And I think in my case, the shutdown was algorithmic, if that makes sense. Maybe some right-leaning person didn't like the content that I was sharing because I talk about issues of race, legacies of slavery, inequality, sort of really hot button issues. And I got more than one report because my account was reported more than once. It probably set off a red flag and they sort of automatically shut down the account without actually looking at the content, which I think is thoughtful and is based on evidence. So I'm not just spewing, hate or inaccurate information. So social media is ephemeral and we don't own it. Social media is also run with algorithms that are pretty much inscrutable to everyone except for those who create it. So what does it mean to engage with social media if you don't know the terms of the game that you're playing? Also, social media platforms are for-profit entities, which is kind of at odds with the goals of radical pedagogy. And I think the goal of radical pedagogy is ultimately liberation from all isms. And so, I don't know if that's Instagram's goal. In fact, I know it's not Instagram's goal or Meta's goal. Meta's goal is to mine information about us, looking at our spending habits, looking at our things that motivate us, the things that grab our attention, selling that information to companies so that those companies can sell us more shit. That's the point of social media. If anyone's watched The Social Dilemma, which I highly suggest you watch, it's streaming on Netflix. Another awful platform, but anyway. But The Social Dilemma has this line that like if the, I forget the exact words that they use, but if the platform is free, then that's not the product. We're the product. We're the product that's being sold to these companies. They're basically selling information about us. It's a way to sort of gain information about the things that we like, the things that motivate us, how we're spending our money, who our connections are. That information is being sold to companies. And that's the purpose of social media. So on that high note, how do we throw a wrench into these algorithms? How do we sort of resist? How do we use social media, but also resist the purpose of social media? Or can you resist? Am I just selling out by leaning so heavily into social media? So I don't expect anyone to answer those questions. It's just something that I'm thinking about as I use Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. I mean, Twitter is owned by Elon Musk. Do I have to say anything else? So yeah, I guess at this point, maybe I can open it up to one's question.
Yeah, questions, and in the chat too, folks in the chat, if you have questions, please share. Dr. Moore asked are the zines online or available for purchase?
Are the what online?
The zines.
Oh, the zine. Oh, yes, you can purchase the zine online. If you go to fashioningtheself.com, and I think the tab is it merch? I called it, or zine. I think it's zine. The tab is zine. Yeah.
And then it looks like Reagan, Dr. Square, thanks for the talk. I love hearing about the larger trajectory of your work. I've been honored to be a writer in the magazine. I was wondering if you use the responses to your posts as guides to what people find interesting, controversial, etc. So maybe Facebook posts generate a lot of discussions or questions. Does this ever inform what you include more or less of, or what will you include in your book or public talks?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question, Reagan. Side note, Reagan is a dear friend that I've known for over 10 years. we met at a parade in Sao Paulo, funny enough. Yeah, in like 2006 maybe. Yeah, I could probably spend the rest of this talk answering that question. It's kind of like one way of thinking about that question is how much attention do I pay to analytics? Yeah, I probably pay more attention to analytics than I should. It's hard not to. That's the thing about social media, that it's meant to be addictive. It's hard not to look at the numbers. It's hard not to look at how many likes a post is getting. I did a post today. If the post did well on Instagram, but it didn't do well on Facebook, which was kind of shocking. Because it's a really interesting post about the work that I did on the design of a stamp for Black History Month. I thought it would go viral, and it didn't. So yeah, actually, I do think about analytics. Sometimes I'll do a post and I'm like, I know this post is not going to be popular, but I think people should know about this. And if only 2 people read it, I don't care, because at least I've connected with 2 people. Other times I do a post and I know it's going to be popular. The kind of posts that I do that are going to be popular, people love old images of well-dressed Black people. Anytime I do a post on that, it's going to do very well. And sometimes I'll do a post knowing that I'm not really pushing forward any new conversations. I just think it's a really beautiful image that people are going to enjoy seeing. Also, the posts that do very well, as you alluded to in your question, are hot button issues. Any post on cultural appropriation is going to be very popular because people just get angry and they have an opinion on it. And that's kind of the currency of social media, unfortunately. And it's kind of the problem with social media, that anything that's going to rile people up is going to be very popular. So people do it on purpose. People play into that. They choose headlines or captions or images that are going to anger people. There's things like, okay, some of the emotions that are the fuel for social media is anger. People like colors. A colorful post is going to do well. People like food. People like sex. People like those are the posts that are going to do well. And it's hard not to like play into that sometimes. You know, it's intellectual content, and sometimes I'm just like, I'm going to do this very conceptual intellectual post and it's not going to do well, and I don't care because I'm going to do it. It's important and people need to know about it, whether they engage or not. And sometimes I do a post knowing that this is just like candy. So I don't, just the last question that you asked, what will you include in your book or public talks? That's a good question. Sometimes I do use Fashioning the Self and Slavery and Freedom as a laboratory. I'll test out an idea and see how it lands with people, if people connect with it. And if people connect with it, then I know it's something that I might consider including in the book. And I've shared a lot of the information that's going to be in my book on social media. Also, what I like about that is that a lot of my followers are smart. And so they ask challenging questions and they suggest books or sources that I can use in my scholarship. So I think a lot of academics are wary of using social media because they're afraid of being plagiarized or someone poaching their ideas. And that's a real concern, and it happens all the time. But I kind of do the exact opposite of that because I've gotten a lot out of sharing my information, and it's really actually pushed my scholarship forward in interesting and innovative ways. So I know that response was all over the place. I hope I somewhat answered it.
Yeah, why don't we open up to the class too? What questions do y'all have? I can move the camera and you raise your hand. And Sylvie?
Yeah, I was just curious about how you go about outreach and expanding your audience and how that might have shifted starting out with Facebook and like now the social media is kind of more widespread. Yeah.
So the question is, how do I think about outreach? And how does that differ depending on the platform?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, the way I think about it is, like I mentioned in the talk, academic writing can be very belabored and inaccessible to a lot of people. And so I try to use language that's more clear. And it's not about dumbing it down. That's not at all. In fact, it's actually harder not to rely on academic jargon as shorthand to actually explain something as if you're talking to your grandmother who is probably very smart, but just doesn't know about, you know, racial capitalism or intersectionality. How do you explain intersectionality to someone who hasn't encountered the term intersectionality before? How do you explain racial capitalism to someone who's affected by racial capitalism, but wouldn't use that term to describe it? And also at the same time, I don't want to lose my writerly voice, because at the end of the day, I am an academic, and so it's a balancing rope, tightrope, a tricky balance. How do you bring an academic flavor, but also reach the widest audience possible? And I think that's ultimately the purpose of language and communication, is to communicate with as many people as possible. The second part of your question about how does it differ from platform to platform, each platform is its own world. Facebook is its own world, Instagram is its own world, Twitter is its own world with its own algorithms. I really don't think too much about that. I do a lot of cross-posting. So whatever I post on Facebook, I post some version of that on Instagram. I post some version of that on Twitter. Whenever I create a video, I post those same videos on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. But you're right that there's different ways of connecting with different audiences. I think I err towards efficiency and reach, but I think another person might decide, I'm going to be a YouTuber, and I'm focusing the majority of my energy on one particular platform, and like tailoring how I share the information for that particular platform. But I'm on 5 platforms, so.
Other questions? I'm gonna move the camera too.
How do you like,
Oh, there.
Yeah. How do you kind of like navigate, I don't know, this is a broad question, but how do you navigate like being on social media, like receiving, I mean, to me, like even not even using it in a creative sense, like it's so overwhelming, but like, I think for a lot of people, whether it be like, I don't know, a whole bunch of different careers, but specifically like the arts and like more creative careers, like there's this expectation that you kind of like have to be on social media to like get your stuff out there. So how do you like find that? And then also it's like, I mean, I'm not sure what your experiences with this are, but like social media can be such a like hateful place. So how do you kind of like balance that and like do the work you want to do, but and like keep your focus?
Yeah, that's a great question. Someone asked me a version of this question yesterday. Her way of asking the question is like, how do you manage all the comments that you get on posts? And the most honest answer is that sometimes I just don't respond to all the comments. You know, I could spend the entire day sort of managing social media very easily. And then, you know, I have a job, like I'm a professor. And sometimes I have to focus on professor things, like my engagement with students, preparing for class. I'm not teaching this semester, thankfully. But sometimes I have to prepare for class. I have to think about publishing. So I have other responsibilities that I also have to juggle. And so my way of like managing social media is sometimes just to simply ignore it. I'm very much that person that like lights a match and then walks away. So sometimes, you know, I have I'll do a post and it's very controversial and it's like the comments are like blowing up and I just simply won't engage. It's like, talk amongst yourself. I wrote the post, but I'm not going to go back and forth with you over this. And sometimes I do like jump into the fray because I'm just having one of those days. Like I got something I want to say, and I want to say it. Other times I just don't engage, and it's a way of like, you know, putting boundaries around my time, and also saving time to do, you know, what I'm actually paid to do, which is be a professor. So yeah, and also I think there's the whole mental health component too, and thankfully we're having conversations about that now. You know, I don't think social media is appropriate for children and even adolescents. It's even tricky for teenagers. It depends on the teenager. But you know, these platforms know that it's addictive and know that it's a space where often hate speech and vitriol is spread, and they do very little to tamp that down. And I think younger people, you know, don't have the tools and aren't equipped with the things to manage the things that they might encounter on social media. So, and even my adult friends, some of them are just said that they opt out of social media altogether because they just don't have the wherewithal to deal with it all. So my solution, my coping mechanism is just to sort of set time aside to create the posts and engage a little bit, but I typically don't do a deep dive. Like I posted this morning, and then, you know, I started my day. I'm currently in Delaware working on an exhibition. And so I've been meeting with curators and digging through collections and talking to marketing. I hadn't really been super connected to social media. So yeah, I have times of the days that I focus on it. Otherwise, I'm just doing other things.
Any questions? Yeah, Kay?
Right, I guess my question is more focusing on if I
Oh, can you speak up a bit?
I guess my question is focusing on if I understood your piece. So when you mentioned in the presentation, titled How Enslaved People Help Shape Fashion History, I think I was really intrigued by the beauty stereotypes. And when I did more research, I found that another professor who was at Harvard, I think had a quote that was interesting because I think she spoke about the act of uncloaking and how in some of the stereotypes, the enslaved people were undressed, and that was something that the Harvard professor who commissioned photographs did to transform a work of art into evidence of science is what I think Sarah Lewis does. So I guess I'm wondering if the purpose of that article, your larger institution building, and maybe even your book's purpose is to trace how enslaved people created works of art by adorning themselves through fashion, and how that can also be linked to the present, or yeah, I guess like present fashion trends too.
I got about 60% of what you said, but I'm wondering if Sandra, can you paraphrase the comment or question?
Yeah. So you're asking about the daguerreotypes at the exhibit, at the Harvard exhibit, and you're wondering about his longer book project in terms of thinking about the history of fashion and enslavement and how that's brought into the present. Is that?
Yeah, I really
Can you repeat it and speak up even more? Sorry.
probably not.
Okay. Or do you want to come over here? No? Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Well, Jonathan, do you want to maybe talk more about what the book project and what direction you're going with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the student was right to highlight that there is a chapter in which the Zealy daguerreotypes figure prominently. And I actually was inspired to write that chapter while I was curating that exhibition, Slavery in the Hands of Harvard. And I was thinking about Du Bois and his self-fashioning I was thinking about the Zélie daguerreotypes, and I was thinking about Henry Louis Gates, just basically Black people's interaction with the university and how it's reflected in the visual material that's created around it. But yeah, the book project, that's one chapter. The book is slightly unusual in that each chapter is related to other chapters, but also sort of stands alone as its own sort of work. But each chapter deals with some form of Black self-fashioning, mostly by enslaved people. But as I mentioned, Du Bois figures prominently in the last chapter. So there's also people who were born free or free people of color in the book as well. So there's a chapter on Du Bois and Harvard and the Zélie daguerreotypes. There's another chapter on Brooks Brothers, which many of you have probably heard of. It's a very sort of preppy, collegiate, all-American brand. It's over 200 years old, but it also made livery, or which is like fancy clothing for domestics. And some of that livery ended up on the backs of enslaved people. So I'll talk about how they ended up manufacturing clothing that ended up on the back of enslaved peoples. There's a chapter on head wraps, thinking about how head wraps are remembered in present day scholarship and how that's not completely accurate or representative of how free and enslaved women were dressing at the time at the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century in New Orleans. So it's sort of rethinking a lot of the scholarship on head wraps. So that's the third chapter. The second chapter is on a free Black woman and trans sex worker who lived in New York City in the early 19th century, and focusing on her self-fashioning using a court case, a lithograph, and several newspaper articles that were written about her. The first chapter is kind of the namesake of the book, but the title of the book is Negro Cloth, How Slavery Birthed the American Fashion Industry. And the first chapter is on Negro cloth, which was a textile manufactured specifically for enslaved people. And in that chapter, I focus on the experience of wearing Negro cloth. There's been some scholarship on cotton and the cotton industry in Negro cloth, but it's more from the perspective of the producers, like capitalists. These are sort of sweeping histories, like commodity histories that sort of ignore, one, the people who actually ended up wearing these clothes, but also ignoring fashion, sort of focusing on the commodity and less on the final product of that commodity. This chapter focuses on the experience of enslaved people wearing these Negro cloths, which were typically durable, but uncomfortable. So someone like Harriet Jacobs talks about wearing Negro cloth. Booker T. Washington refers to Negro cloth. Frederick Douglass has a reference to Negro cloth. I also use the WPA narratives and look at references to the experience of wearing Negro cloth. So that's the first chapter. There's of course an intro and conclusion, which I give sort of a sweeping history of enslaved people's relationship with fashion.
Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. That flew by, but we just want to thank you so much for visiting us and talking with us about your work. And yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think we should.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Rick, for joining. Thank you, Doria.
There's a couple more
Two
questions
friends.
in the chat too, so I don't know.
Oh,
if you-
okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to leave it open too. I know you all have to leave or go places, but yeah, you want to have a look at those questions, and I'm gonna come over here and wave because I've been behind the camera the whole time. But thanks so much.
You're welcome. Should I answer Portia's
You're
question?
welcome to. Yeah, if you want, I'm happy to leave it open.
Let me see. Portia, I'm a professor of museum studies in Florida. Given the fact that race-related scholarship is being openly challenged in the press, what is your response to this trend in states where race-related scholarship is tenuous? Yeah, it's scary. It's unfortunate. I'm thankful that I live in a place and I'm at an institution where people don't question the validity of my research, but that's not true everywhere. Like you're in Florida, it must be, feel very tenuous for you. Literally people's jobs are on the line. I was struck by the AP exam in African American Studies was edited significantly based on Ron DeSantis's objections. So yeah, I find it worrisome, and it's really unfortunate, and it says a lot about the state of secondary education and also higher education. But it also inspires me to continue doing the work that I do.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I need to close out because they have to take the equipment, but your co-host, so you're welcome to stay on if there's more questions, but thank you so much, Jonathan. All right.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.